Let go and let God, right? So God's up in heaven, and he sends an angel down to say, how many good people are there on earth? And so the angel comes back and said, I think about 5%. And so he said, well, that can't be right. So he sends another angel down. And the angel goes around and comes back and he says, it's about 5%. He says, well, you know what? I'm going to send an email to those 5%. You know what the email said? I didn't get one either. So fortunately, in the science of mind, we don't believe in that big guy in the sky who is up there, judging everybody. We know that that's not the truth. We know that that presence and that power is right where we are. And so we're talking this month about freedom of choice and open communication. Open communication is our value, and Gracism is the book. And Gracism is a book that was written by a Christian pastor by the name of David Anderson. And it's interesting that we're teaching the Bible because, of course, being a Christian, he is Bible-based. And so he is talking about the New Testament, of course. And he found a passage that he used to just sort of run through and think about, why did this guy write this? But now it's hitting home. That's the thing about all the sacred texts, all the sacred scriptures that we may encounter, is that they speak to us individually if we take the time to open to the wisdom that's ours. So in other words, the same passage could be read by you and you think, so what? And I read it and it's like, I got it, because we have different perceptions and we're at different stages in our consciousness. And so we're ready to receive. Reading it again, and I've told you that, when I read the Science of Mind textbook, which I've read so many times, I often come across a passage that I somehow skipped over before that really hits me. It's like, oh, wow, now I get it. Because he does say the same thing over and over in different ways, and it's sort of like, oh, now, this time I got that. This time I got that. Now, the title of this talk, was the one given to us by Home Office. So it's Prejudice and Sin. And it was like, prejudice and sin? I'm going to talk about prejudice and sin? But prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So Pastor Anderson does talk about the fact that, you might think, well, why should I give money to the homeless? They're a bunch of bums. They are drug addicts and, whatever. We have these preconceived notions about why people are on the street. But I remember having the experience of doing Hospitality House one night when we were still doing it at churches. And actually, this time it was at the Salvation Army there up on Alta Street. And at that time, we not only made the dinner, but we had an opportunity to have the dinner with the people who were homeless so we could talk to them. And so we sat down and I started talking to this man. And he was like in his 40s perhaps, late 40s. And it turned out that he had a teenage daughter who was killed in an automobile accident when she was with her boyfriend. And she had been killed, and that so devastated him that he started drinking. And he lost his job, and he lost his wife, and he became homeless. And now he was trying to get back on track, but he was still so filled with that grief for that beloved daughter. And, we don't have any idea of the story behind why people end up in a homeless situation. It is not ours to judge where they're coming from. So that's where a possible prejudice was alleviated by an actual experience with someone. So when we have an actual experience, then we can't have that prejudice anymore because we can't make that gross generalization. We can't generalize about all homeless are blah, blah, because we know someone, we've spoken to them, and we've heard what that is all about. Now, as Shara alluded to earlier, we also know that sin is an old English archery term that means you missed the mark. It means you missed the mark. You made a mistake. So there is no sin but a mistake. So Ernest Holmes says, there is no sin but a mistake, and no punishment but an inevitable consequence of whatever we chose in that moment that might have been mistaken, but we receive the consequences of that action. And so we are not punished for our sins, we are punished by the law of cause and effect, that an inevitable consequence arises from that decision. And so we do something, and it causes something that we didn't anticipate, didn't expect, and didn't want. And so what happens? Well, we get to choose again. We get to make another choice. Hopefully we get to learn. Because Emerson said, and I actually found out he was quoting Christopher Marlowe, there is no sin but ignorance. There is no sin but ignorance. And there was another quote that said, that understanding abolishes prejudice and sin. Understanding. And I also loved what Will Rogers said about, he said, everybody's ignorant, only on different subjects. What a wise guy. He was very wise. So we are dealing with the Bible because what this book, Gracism, which is about bringing God into racism so that we can move beyond racism, we can bring grace into that experience. And as we said last week, grace is just given. It's not earned. It's not something you get because you did this and that and the other thing. It's just given. And so it's about opening to grace as an opportunity to move past this experience of racism. So he talks about the quote in the Bible from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 about Paul talking about how everything is the body of God. And he says, the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. And he says, on the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. So what he did was, he being Pastor Anderson, he took that passage and sort of reframed it. So the part that talks about our presentable parts need no special treatment, he's talking about reframing that as, I will share with you. I will share with you. So he talks about two experiences at the airport. The first experience was where he and a friend were traveling, and they'd come from somewhere else, and then they landed like at Heathrow, and then they found out they both had tickets, but Pastor Anderson had an economy ticket, and his friend had a business ticket, and he was supposed to be in business class, but when they got there, it turned out the reservation was messed up, and they were both in economy. So the counter agent apologized and said, well, we could put you on a later flight and you could have the business class. So he had to choose between comfort and community. And what he chose was community. He decided to sit in the economy with his friend and visit for 7 hours on their flight back. And so they had a great time, and now they talk about that and they laugh about it. But it was a choice of, okay, am I going to choose comfort or community? And he chose community. And another time, he actually got to fly first class with another friend. And so when they were between flights, they went to the special first class lounge and tried to get in there, but they didn't have the right card to get into the lounge. And so they're standing there. He's an African American. He's with a Latino guy. And they're standing there, and the person is apologizing, but she can't let them in. And a white man comes up behind them and says, "They're with me." Now, they don't know this guy. He says, "They're with me." And he brings them in. And so they all went in. And as they're sitting around having some snacks together, it turns out that the white guy knew of the black guy. He knew this pastor. And he was a pastor in Houston. And Anderson is a pastor in Washington, D.C. And they had heard of each other, and they'd always wanted to meet each other. And there they were, meeting each other in the first class lounge. Funny how God does that. And he said what he understood from meeting this man, that gracism, that just giving and lifting other people and sharing with other people was just who he was. He didn't have to think about it. It was just who he was. So he was a gracist. So what we're aspiring to be is gracists. Okay, so I will share with you. And it's about getting over this whole thing about pecking order. You know, I can make myself feel good by thinking I'm better than you. You know, I can, because I have a BMW, I could do anything I want on the road. The laws don't apply to me. You know, I remember we used to have a joke that said, "What's the difference between a porcupine and a Porsche?" Do you remember that one? With a Porsche, the prick is on the inside. So, you know, I'm sorry if you drive a Porsche, just kidding. But it's about that whole thing about, you know, who's got the best car, who's got the best house, who's got the best, you know, Vitamix. Who knows? You know, you've got to be better than somebody else by making someone less than. And what we're saying is gracists don't do that. Everyone gets lifted. I will share with you. And the pastor defines no special treatment is, I refuse to accept favors or perks that may hurt you. I refuse to accept favors or perks that may hurt you. And I heard an interview last night with Trevor Noah, who does The Daily Show now. And he's written a book called Born a Crime, growing up in South Africa. And he grew up in South Africa under apartheid. And his father was a white Swiss guy, and his mother was a black South African. And so the fact that he existed was evidence of a crime, that they had carnal knowledge of one another. And so he had to, hide. His father could never be with him in public. His mother could be with him. But his mother actually had a friend who, because her child was light, he was considered colored rather than black. So she had a colored friend, and the colored friend would take her son to the park, and the mother would go like she was the maid and walk behind them. Anyway, so he grew up in this atmosphere, but they would go to visit the black family in Soweto, and he would be playing with his cousins. And one time he was playing doctor with one of his cousins, and he was inserting a match, which was his surgical instrument, into her ear. And he accidentally, perforated her eardrum. And so she was screaming. And so the grandmother came in, and she, comforted the little girl and found out she was okay. Then she beat her. Then she beat the older cousin who was supposed to be watching them and making sure they weren't doing anything stupid. But she didn't beat Trevor, and he was waiting for his beating, but she didn't beat him. So then later on, his mother came back to the grandmother's house, and the grandmother was sitting in the kitchen crying. And her mother said, his mother went to her and said, what's wrong? And she said, oh, that Trevor is such a little devil. And so his mother said, well, beat him. And she said, I don't know how to beat a white child. They get blue and green, and I don't know how to beat a white child. And so he knew from that moment that he was privileged, that he wouldn't get beaten. Now the thing is, some of us don't realize that we're privileged. That just the color of our skin gives us entitlements that we're not even aware of. If we get stopped for a minor infraction on the road, we might get a ticket, or we might even just get off with a warning. But a black man has to really be in fear about getting stopped for anything. So we don't realize our sense of entitlement. Another aspect of this was that there is this phrase that says, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it. So what does giving greater honor mean? He says it means, I will honor you. I will honor you. And he says there are 4 ways to give great honor. One is service, second is speech, the third is stewardship, and the fourth is sitting. So he talked about service and being personal and institutional or systematized. In other words, he was talking about someone had come to him asking for a donation to an organization that was helping Latinos. And he was thinking about it, and he thought, well, what if there are illegals and all of this kind of thing? And then he said, well, wait a minute. I've had Latinos in my congregation, and I've had them come to my home, and I can help them individually. So why not give to an organization that can help a whole bunch of them and not worry about whether they're legal or illegal? If they need help, why not help? And so that's what he did. So we can donate to organizations that are doing good in the world. So we can do it personally and systemically as well, to organizations that may be helping us to change, helping us to make a change. He was teaching a class, okay, and then speech is the next thing. He was teaching a workshop, and in this workshop, they were talking about different things, and he said, what we have to do is to counteract a negative story with a positive one. And so this guy stood up, and he was an African-American man in his 50s, and he was going on and on about the Koreans and how the Koreans were taking over the neighborhood and they were stealing from the community because they were the grocery stores and the cleaners and all of these things, and they were taking advantage of the community and going on and on. I've never met a Korean person who was a good person. There's no good Korean person. And so the pastor said, well, I think I've met many good Korean people who own stores and some who didn't. I know lots of good Korean people. And he said, oh yeah, pastor, sure. So tell me the name of one of them. And the pastor said, well, actually, I'll have to invite you over for dinner because my wife is Korean and she's lovely. Ha 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 ha, he said after the guy pulled his jaw up off the floor, he sat down. So, we have to balance callous words and dishonoring speech with personal examples that are honoring and that are positive. So we gently give that positive example. We give the truth as we know it. And stewardship means that we're taking care of not just our family and our bubble, we're reaching out to care for others. And so he joined a group that cares for, he joined Big Brothers and became a big brother to a 13-year-old boy. And this young boy's father is incarcerated. And he found out, how difficult it is for the children of incarcerated people. And there's actually an organization called Amachi. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, but it was founded by Dr. Wilson Good, who is the former mayor of Philadelphia, and he was the son of an incarcerated father. And he was taken in by a pastor and his wife that shifted the trajectory of his life. And many studies have shown that mentoring can really help kids who are, having difficulties, like the Friendship Club. I mean, that's a wonderful organization for at-risk girls. So there are ways that we can serve to be stewards not only of our own lives, but of the community as well. And the other thing is sitting, just being with people. Sometimes, you're talking to someone, people who live alone, maybe they don't get out much. Have the patience to just listen. Have the patience to just be a presence who is willing to let them go on and on and on about everything that they're talking about. Or to visit people who are in the hospital or in a rehab facility. To just be with them. You don't have to do anything special. Just be. Be there. Be a presence for them. So that's sitting. So I have to tell you this story because I went to visit a friend of mine who is struggling with cancer and has been for a long, long time. She's been on the leading edge of all of these medical changes that are happening because, they give her this medicine and that helps for a while and then they give her another medicine. So she's been in chemotherapy for about 5 years now. And she said at one point, she was taking this new medication. She said it was really kicking her butt. And so she was like, oh, Jesus. She said, like she just called out. She just said, Jesus, help, where are you? And so the next day she went over to her favorite thrift store. She goes on Tuesdays because it's Senior Discount Tuesday, to the thrift store. And she went to the thrift store, and sure enough, there was a red hot pink Jesus in the store. A red hot pink Jesus. And not only that, it was like one of those 8 balls. You turned it over and it gave you the answer. I'll ask my dad. That was the answer. Or you are forgiven, So she immediately bought it. And when she was leaving, she met her pastor. She goes to Unity. And she met her pastor, and he loved it, so he blessed it. And he said, please bring it to the board meeting. So, but she said, it really was a gift because it showed me, when I looked at it, the answers are on the inside. The answers are on the inside. So we're called to see the good. We're called to share it. We're called to lift each other up. Each of us becoming gracists is how we heal ourselves and heal our world. So, our affirmation for today is, I open my eyes to the heaven here today. I open my eyes to the heaven here today. I open my eyes to the heaven here today. I open my eyes to the heaven here today. And so it is.